Hey guys, I'm going to be reading to you today from Hinds' Feet on High Places by Hannah Hernard. Chapter 1, In the Village of Much Trembling. This is the story of a young girl named Much Afraid, who learned to trust the chief shepherd. It is the story of how she left her fearing relatives and went with the shepherd to the high places where perfect love gets rid of fear. Much Afraid lived in a peaceful little white cottage in the Valley of Humiliation. She had many friends who lived in the same village as she did. Many of her neighbors in the village of Much Trembling worked for the chief shepherd. For several years, Much Afraid herself had been in his service. She loved her work and really wanted to make the shepherd happy, but in her heart, Much Afraid worried. She worried about her crippled body. Her feet were so crooked that she limped and often fell down as she went about her work. She also worried about her mouth. It too was so crooked that it was hard for her to speak clearly. Much Afraid felt that she was not very pretty. More than anything else, Much Afraid wanted to be beautiful, graceful, and strong, like so many of the shepherd's other workers. In fact, she wanted to be like the chief shepherd himself, but she was afraid that would never be possible. There was another, even greater trouble in her life. Much Afraid was a member of the family of Fearings, and her relatives lived all over the valley. She could never get away from them. Much Afraid was an orphan and had grown up in the home of her aunt, poor Mrs. Dismal Forebodings. Dismal Forebodings means always being afraid and worried about all the terrible things that might happen. So Much Afraid had lived with her aunt and her cousin Gloomy and Spiteful and their brother Craven Fear. Craven means to be very afraid. He was a bully who always did mean things to Much Afraid. The family of Fearings hated the chief shepherd and were very upset that Much Afraid was one of his servants. They kept trying to make her quit working for him. Then one awful day, her relatives came to the cottage where Much Afraid lived and announced that she was to marry Craven Fear. What a horrible idea! She should have ordered them all to leave her cottage, but poor Much Afraid listened to her fearing relatives. She just cowered before them, repeating again and again that nothing would ever make her marry Craven Fear. When they finally left her alone, it was early evening. Suddenly, Much Afraid thought of something that made her feel happier. The chief shepherd would be bringing his flocks of sheep to the watering place beside the village. Much Afraid met him there every morning to learn his wishes for the day, and again in the evenings to give him her report of the day's work. Still shaking with fear, she came to the pool where the shepherd was waiting for her. She told him what her family of Fearings had said. "What can I do?" she cried. "They can't really make me marry Craven, can they?" "Oh, it is bad enough to be Much Afraid. I couldn't stand to be Mrs. Craven Fear for the rest of my life." "Don't be afraid," the shepherd said gently. "You are in my service, and if you trust me, they will not be able to force you." He paused for a moment, then continued. "Much Afraid, you should never have let your fearing relatives into your cottage. They are enemies of the king whom you serve." "I know, oh, I know," cried Much Afraid, "but whenever I meet any of my relatives, I feel so weak. As long as I live in the valley, I will keep meeting them. They are everywhere. Now I will be too afraid to leave my cottage." Much Afraid looked across the valley and river to the beautiful mountains. She cried out with all her heart, "Oh, if only I could leave this valley and go to the high places. The Fearings and my other relatives could never reach me there." To her great surprise, the shepherd answered, "I have waited a long time to hear you say those words, Much Afraid. It would be best for you to leave the valley and go to the high places. You need to live in the kingdom of love. No fears of any kind are there because perfect love gets rid of fear." Much Afraid stared at him in amazement. "Go to the high places?" she exclaimed, "and live there? Oh, if only I could. For months I have been thinking about it, day and night, but it's not possible. I could never get there. I am too crippled." She looked down at her crooked feet, and her eyes filled with tears. "The mountains are so steep and dangerous. I have been told that only deer can move on them safely. Dear reader, from now on we will refer to deer as harts and hinds. Harts are a kind of a male deer and hinds are female deer. It is quite true that the way up to the high places is both difficult and dangerous, said the shepherd. It has to be so that nothing which is of an enemy of love can get into the kingdom. Nothing crippled or deformed is allowed, and the people who live there do not need hinds' feet. I have them myself, he added with a smile, and I can go leaping on the mountains with the greatest of ease and pleasure. Much afraid, I could make your feet like hinds' feet too and set you upon the high places. You could then serve me much better and be out of reach of all your enemies. Much afraid stared at him. Make my feet like hinds' feet? She repeated. How is that possible? And what about my crooked, ugly mouth? It is true, said the shepherd, that you would have to be changed before you could live on the high places. But if you are willing to go with me, I promise to help you. Up on the mountains, as you get closer to the high places, the air is so clean that it will strengthen your whole body. There are healing streams where everything that is not beautiful is washed away. There is something else I must tell you. No member of the fearing family can enter the kingdom of love. You will have to be given a new name first. Are you willing, much afraid, to be changed completely and to be made like the new name you will receive? She nodded her head and said, Yes, I am. Much afraid left her meeting with the shepherd, feeling as though she would never be afraid again. She began to sing one of her favorite songs from the great book, the book that shepherds love to sing from as they worked among the flocks and led them through the fields. Happily she walked along when suddenly she saw Craven Fear. Poor Much Afraid, her heart filled with a terrible panic. She looked right and left, but there was no place to hide. Craven Fear was coming right toward her. Well, here you are at last, little Much Afraid. So we are to be married. What do you think of that? He pinched her as though trying to play, but it hurt very much. Then he grabbed her, and poor Much Afraid cried out in pain. Suddenly, Craven Fear let go of her and backed away. The shepherd was there. One look at his flashing eyes and uplifting shepherd's staff was more than enough for that bully. Craven Fear turned and ran away. Much Afraid started to cry. Of course she should have known that Craven Fear was a coward. All she needed to do was call for the shepherd, and that bully would have run away at once. Now her dress was torn, her arms were bruised, and her heart was full of shame. She didn't dare look at the shepherd. She supposed that he too was thinking how silly she was to be so afraid. But if she had looked, she would have seen how tenderly the shepherd watched her as she limped toward the village. Much Afraid woke early the next morning, and all her fears were gone. Her first thought was about the shepherd. Probably sometime today she would start for the high places with him. This so excited her that she could hardly eat her breakfast, and as she began getting ready for her journey, she sang a song from the shepherd's great book. All morning, whenever she thought of the shepherd, she would run to the door or to the window to see if he was coming to call her. By noon, he still had not come, but some others came. All of a sudden, before she realized what was happening, there was a trampling of feet and many noisy voices. And then she was surrounded by a whole army of aunts, uncles, and cousins. Leading the pack was Aunt Dismal, and her daughters, Gloomy and Spiteful. Next was Lord Fearing himself, followed by Coward. They rushed right into her cottage and locked the door. The whole family talked on and on about how she needed to spend more time with her relatives and how marriage to Craven would be the best thing for her to do. They told her that she could help him become a kinder and better person. Much Afraid sat and listened to their voices. Suddenly, they all heard something outside. In the distance was the sound of a man singing one of the songs from the book which Much Afraid loved so well. Then the singer himself came in view, slowly passing along the lane. It was the chief shepherd, already leading his flock to the watering place. As she listened to his song, much afraid realized that the shepherd was calling her to go with him. But here she was, locked in with her terrible fears and unable to respond to his call. She did not realize that the Fearings were holding their breath in case she would respond, because if she did, they would all run wildly out the door. Poor Much Afraid was too frightened to call, and then it was too late. The next morning, she felt Coward's heavy hand over her mouth, and many other hands tightly holding her down on the chair. When they were very sure the shepherd was gone, they let her go, and realized Much Afraid had fainted. They would have carried her away right then and there, but decided it was too dangerous. The people of the village would soon be returning from their work. The Fearings decided to wait until dark when no one could see them. Then they would take her to Mary Craven Fear. They laid Much Afraid on her bed and started to look through her cupboards for something to eat. Gloomy was told to watch Much Afraid in case she woke up. Gradually, she did wake up and nearly fainted again when she saw her cottage still full of fearing relatives. She didn't dare call for help because all her neighbors were away at work. But were they? Just then, she heard the voice of her neighbor, Mrs. Valiant. Valiant means to be very, very brave. Gloomy was quite unprepared for what happened. Suddenly, Much Afraid jumped out of her bed and shouted through the window as loudly as she could. "Valiant! Valiant! Come and help me! Come quickly! Help!" Mrs. Valiant looked across the garden and saw Much Afraid's terrified face at the window. The next moment, the face was jerked away and the curtain was closed. That was enough for Mrs. Valiant. She hurried to the cottage and tried to open the door. Finding it locked, she looked in through a window and saw the room full of Much Afraid's relatives. That brave lady put her head right in through the open window and cried out with a loud voice, "Out of this house you go this minute, every one of you. If you are not gone in 3 seconds, I will call the chief shepherd. This cottage belongs to him, and you'll be in big trouble if he finds you here." Immediately the door was unlocked, and out poured the Fearings, tumbling over each other in their hurry to get away. Mrs. Valiant smiled in satisfaction as she watched them run. Then she went into the cottage to Much Afraid, who was still shaking with fear, and heard the whole story of what had happened. Mrs. Valiant made her a nice hot cup of tea and fixed her supper from the food the Fearings had been ready to eat. Then she cleaned up the mess and the unwelcome visitors had made and tucked Much Afraid into bed. Before leaving the cottage, Mrs. Valiant put a bell beside the bed. "If you need help during the night, just ring that bell," she told Much Afraid, "and the whole Valiant family will come over right away." Then Mrs. Valiant left, carefully looking around the cottage, locking the door and taking the extra key that Much Afraid had given to her. For hours, Much Afraid lay in her bed, unable to sleep. Her body was bruised and her mind was troubled. There was something important I was supposed to do, she thought. But she couldn't remember what it was. Finally, she fell asleep. She woke suddenly an hour or two later, and she sat straight up in her bed. The place in her heart where the shepherd had planted the seed of love was throbbing with pain. Now she remembered what had bothered her before she had fallen asleep. The shepherd had called, as he promised, but she hadn't gone to him or even answered. What if he thought she had changed her mind and didn't want to go with him? What if he had already gone and left her behind? The shock of that thought was awful. Much Afraid had to see for herself at once if he had really gone away and left without her. She got out of bed, dressed as quickly as her shaking fingers would let her, and unlocked the cottage door. Opening the door, she went out into the darkness. 100 craven fears on the lonely streets of Much Trembling could not have stopped her at that moment, as Much Afraid started off to look for the shepherd. She went as quickly as possible, with her crooked feet, limping along the village streets toward the open fields and the sheepfolds, toward the watering place. It was almost dawn. Would he be there? Just as the sky turned red above the mountain, she saw him. He was there, standing by the pool, looking toward her with the light of the sunrise shining on his face. As Much Afraid stumbled toward him, he stepped quickly to her side. She fell down at his feet, sobbing, "Oh, my shepherd, take me with you as you said. Don't leave me behind." I knew you would come, he said gently, but much afraid. Why were you not here at the pool as usual last evening? Didn't you hear me when I passed your cottage and called? I wanted you to be ready to start with me this morning at sunrise. I am here right now, said Much Afraid, still kneeling at his feet, and I will go with you anywhere. Then the shepherd took her by the hand and they started toward the mountains.